Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. It is yet another week where we're looking at an overperformance from the number one movie at the box office and a little bit of validation for me as Twisters had a big $80+ million debut. We're going to break that down. We're going to look at the rest of the box office. We're also going to look at streaming charts at the end of the show, preview what's coming out this week. There's a lot to get to, so let's jump right into the box office top 10 for this past weekend. And as I mentioned, at number one was Twisters, which brought in an estimated $80.5 million. I've seen indications late tonight as I'm prepping the show that we could see an even higher gross, maybe around $82 million. This thing has been overperforming all weekend, but still well above what was expected of the movie, and we'll look at a lot more as far as Twisters opening weekend in just a couple minutes. In second place was Despicable Me 4, which dropped 45.4% in its third week of release, $23.8 million for a $259.4 million total so far. Inside Out 2 remains in the top three. It dropped 35.9% in weekend number 6 for $12.8 million. Its domestic total is now approaching $600 million. Longlegs really held up well considering that there was a lot of mixed word of mouth that it was a horror movie. It dropped less than 57%, 47.8% in weekend number 2, a total right around $11.7 million. Its running total is at $44.6 million. So the one thing that we know right now about Longlegs is that it will not have short legs. It might have medium legs. It may have long legs. We don't quite know, but definitely not short legs. In fifth place was A Quiet Place Day 1 in its fourth weekend of release. It dropped 46.3% for a $6.1 million weekend. Its domestic total is now at around $127.6 million. Fly Me to the Moon took a big tumble in weekend number 2. It dropped 64.5%, so not great news for Apple. $3.3 million on the weekend. Its domestic total is now at $16.3 million. Bad Boys Ride or Die spent a seventh week in the top 10. It dropped 37.1% for a $2.6 million weekend. Its domestic total is now at $189.3 million. In eighth place was a film from India called Bad News. It made just over $1 million. This is a Hindi language comedy about a woman who's pregnant with twins from two different fathers. So a pretty unique plot there. In ninth place was Maxine. It came in under $1 million. It dropped 60.4% in its third weekend for $819,000. Its domestic total is at $13.9 million. This is interesting. The Bike Riders jumps back up into the top 10 with a 75% increase from last week. In its fifth weekend in release, it brought in around $700,000 for a $21.2 million total. I'm not quite sure what's behind that big jump. It could be some kind of a data reporting error, or it could be that Universal, because this was a Focus Features / Universal film, attached it to Twisters in some capacity on the drive-in circuit, and so that basically forced ticket sales for the Bike Riders. But either way, it sees a big jump in business and comes back up into the top 10 in week number 5. So let's talk a little bit about Twisters. It was expected to open, or it was tracking to open, around $50 million. It opened at about $80 million. And this is one of those cases where, sometimes, and I'm actually working on a separate video with this, with tracking and stuff like that, Hollywood just kind of struggles to predict what happens to movies that aren't targeted at the exact typical moviegoer in the exact typical movie-going places, because we saw this every time with like Wonder Woman and Barbie, with Black Panther, with movies like that where they are big with audiences that aren't, your 18 to 34-year-old white male demographic, and people are like losing their mind going like, how could this happen? And we're seeing that with Twisters because the movie performed exceptionally well, and really that's what lifted it up to these heights in what are derogatorily called the flyover states. I even read it in some of the articles talking about the box office. Well, it did very well in the flyover states. Yeah, those would be the states where I live, and the states where a lot of people live, and the states that really brought Twisters to the top of the box office with a bang. And it's shocking because there's so many box office analysts that are like, well, how could this happen? If you make a movie that's set in Middle America, that's made by filmmakers from Middle America, that's marketed to Middle America, we're shocked that this movie's doing so well in Middle America. It's just kind of funny. I've lived in LA. I kind of know the mentality out there. There is this sort of thing of like LA and New York, they're the only two places that matter when it comes to movies. And with movies like Avengers Endgame, for example, yes, the box office grosses are driven by theaters in Los Angeles and New York because they're the big population centers. But Twisters is a movie that really did appeal to that Middle America demographic, and they turned out in force to see this movie. With that $80+ million opening, when we look at the top 3-day opening weekends of the year so far domestically, Twisters right now is at number 3. It's just ahead of Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. It's just behind Dune Part 2. We'll see what that final number comes in at. If it overperforms by another $2 million, it could challenge Dune Part 2 for the second best domestic opening of the year. If, however, it was an undercount and it comes in below $80.5 million, it could fall behind Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. We'll just see what that final number is, and I'll talk about it on next week's show. As far as movies about natural disasters, or at least the ones that we have box office records for, Twisters set the record there at $80.5 million. The previous record was The Day After Tomorrow back in 2004, which opened at $68.7 million. Then we had 2012, which opened in 2009 at $65.2 million. The Rock's San Andreas back in 2015 at $54.5 million, and Noah back in 2014 at $43.7 million. But the disaster movie genre is one that has been around for a while, so when we crunch the numbers, looking back at the box office records that we have, The Day After Tomorrow, when you adjust for inflation, has the all-time record at $114.3 million, followed by 2012 at $95.5 million. But this is so interesting. Next is Twister from 1996 at $82.2 million adjusted for inflation, but Twisters opened to almost the exact same number, $80.5 million, and it could be even closer if it did actually overperform these estimates. Deep Impact's in 5th place at $79.3 million, but that's pretty impressive. To have a movie like Twister in 1996 that opens, you have a quasi-legacy sequel that opens almost 30 years later, and it draws almost the exact same amount of people, or at least the same amount of box office revenue. I think that's a real achievement. Now, that's not to say that Twisters is going to make the same amount of money in the long run if you adjust for inflation as Twister did, because the box office worked differently. You had movies that hung around longer, that had longer legs, but still, I think it's really impressive that you could have a movie like Twisters come in and even compare to the original, especially because the first Twister movie was such an attraction due to its special effects and all that stuff. So it was a big weekend for Twisters. Let's also look at where Despicable Me 4 falls in the Illumination canon. Right now, it is at number 9 as far as all-time domestic grosses for Illumination films. It's now past the original Despicable Me film. It's just below Despicable Me 3. And in the next week or so, it should get up there to number 6, where The Grinch is. And then we'll see how far it goes, perhaps into the top 5, if it can get to that $336 million mark. Also, looking at the Despicable Me / Minions franchise, this is through 19 days of release, and it's a pattern that holds to what we saw last week. The first Despicable Me film is on the bottom there. Despicable Me 3 is the one that's kind of one up from Despicable Me. And then we have that cluster of movies, The Rise of Gru, Minions, and Despicable Me 2, that are all sort of competing there for that top spot. But the interesting thing about Despicable Me 4 is that it is closing that gap. It was a much wider gap between those top 3 movies and Despicable Me 4 last week. Now, part of it is that these are all different release cycles. Some of these movies opened on Friday, some of these movies opened on Wednesday, and so over time, you're going to see these things normalize out a little bit, but it looked for a while like Despicable Me 4 was going to be pretty solidly underneath that top trio of movies, but it looks more and more like it may actually be competing with them. So this is something that we are going to keep watching in the weeks ahead. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Inside Out 2 as well. I noted that it is at almost $600 million domestically. It is now the second highest grossing animated film of all time domestically. It has passed the Super Mario Brothers movie, and it's about $12 million away from taking the number 1 spot from Incredibles 2 as far as the highest grossing animated film of all time domestic. Please don't mention The Lion King. We have gone over this many times on the show before. So by the end of its run, Inside Out 2 will be the highest grossing Pixar film both domestically and worldwide. That's pretty impressive. When we look at the franchise tracker for Pixar by domestic gross right now, it is of course at number 2 behind Incredibles 2. And looking at these movies adjusted for inflation, Inside Out 2 will soon pass Toy Story 3 for number 4 on this list, and it will be really competing with Finding Dory and Finding Nemo for that number 3, number 2 spot. I don't think it's going to get up there to number 1, but still an easy, a solid top 5 Pixar film, even when you adjust for inflation. Looking at the cumulative domestic gross for Inside Out 2 through 38 days of release, I was looking at it compared compared to Incredibles 2. It's obvious now that Inside Out 2 is going to bypass Incredibles 2 domestically. So this is Inside Out 2, that's the blue line, versus Barbie, the #1 grossing movie of last summer, and then Jurassic World. Why Jurassic World? Because Jurassic World is currently the #10 highest grossing film domestically of all time. And you can see that Inside Out 2 still is just barely ahead of where Barbie was at this point in its release. They really are almost intersecting at this point. So we'll see which movie ultimately comes out on top. But you can also see that it's still running fairly far behind where Jurassic World was at this point in its release. So I would say that it's a toss-up as to whether Inside Out 2 actually ends up outgrossing last summer's #1 movie, Barbie. But it looks like, unless it can really close some of that gap in the next couple weeks or so, that it will fall short of that #10 all-time domestic mark. However, that has narrowed a little bit, so I'm going to keep tracking this. If Inside Out 2 really does have that closing speed, it could make it up there to #10, but it's looking unlikely at this point. I also want to talk a little bit about Longlegs. I said last week that it was the biggest opening weekend ever in the history of Neon by a lot, and this was the second best weekend ever for any Neon movie at any point in its release cycle, again by a lot. So now Longlegs has the 2 highest grossing weekends ever for Neon. That bumps Parasite in its 19th week of release as it headed into that Oscar season down to #3 at $5.6 million. The opening week of Immaculate is now at #4, and the opening weekend of Ferrari is now down at #5. And Longlegs is also the second highest grossing film ever released by Neon. It has passed I, Tonya, and it is less than $10 million away from passing Parasite. So unless things really slow down, it looks like this movie will become the highest grossing film in Neon's history. And again, we talked about this last week, not on a substantially higher production and marketing budget than they usually work with. So this has been a real win for Neon, and the fact that it is holding well at the box office looks like it's going to put it in the driver's seat as far as all-time success stories for that distributor. These are the movies that dropped out of the top 10 this past weekend. Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1 crashed out after 3 weeks, so if audiences are going to discover the film, as the studio said they were delaying the release of Chapter 2 in order to let happen, they will not be discovering it in theaters. Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, not even able to come close to replicating the success of Sound of Freedom last summer. It's out after 2 weeks. And then Indian 2 spent just 1 week in the domestic top 10. When we look at the biggest theater count changes for this past weekend, Maxine lost the most theaters of any film, with 1,332 theaters lost. It's now just barely still in wide release at 1,038 theaters. Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1 already lost a lot of theaters last weekend. It lost over half of its remaining theaters this past weekend, 1,296 of them. It's now in 1,291. Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, falls out of wide release. It lost 1,257 theaters. It's now in just 880. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes lost the vast majority of its remaining theaters. It lost 855 theaters this past weekend. It's now playing in just 150. And Kinds of Kindness lost the bulk of its theaters. It lost 580. It's now also still playing in 150. And we will have probably the widest release of the year so far in Deadpool and Wolverine coming up this weekend. So there are a lot of movies, a lot more movies that are going to be surrendering auditoriums around the country. This is what I like to call my box office road to recovery. The red line is the box office weekend average for the years 2021 to 2023. The blue line is the weekend average for 2015 to 2019, and the dotted black line is this past weekend. And you can see that we are a little bit below where we have been traditionally according to the red line, and still substantially below where the box office was pre-pandemic. But the fact that we are so close to that average is pretty impressive, considering that part of that 2021 to 2023 average is the huge Barbenheimer opening weekend, which was this past weekend last year. And many people thought that it was going to be a huge letdown, but essentially what we saw was half of that equation. Twisters put up roughly what Oppenheimer put up last year. We were just missing that massive #1 movie in Barbie. But really, I thought it was going to be a pretty bloody weekend considering the drop off from last year with Barbenheimer, but we were able to get about half of that equation back on the board with Twisters overperforming, so it kind of blunted that drop a little bit, and so it looks a little less nasty when we look at this chart. The number one performing movie for 2021 to 2023 was, of course, Barbie, which had a massive debut this past weekend a year ago. The number one movie for the years 2015 to 2019 was I'm not calling it animated, but it's also not really live action, The Lion King, which had a massive debut back in 2019. And looking at the weekend ahead for Twisters, I think what we're going to see on next week's show is maybe a surprisingly sharper drop for the film given its popularity and its big word of mouth with audiences. And that's because it loses pretty much all of its premium large format theaters, the IMAXs and the Dolbys, etc., because those are going to be taken over by Deadpool and Wolverine. That's one of the disadvantages of the release date for Twisters. It really only gets a week in those formats, and it could be a case like Mission Impossible last year where the box office suffers a large amount. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. I don't think it's a movie that people are saying they have to see in these big theaters, but I think you are going to see a week-to-week drop because the higher ticket prices with the premium large format theaters are all going to go to Deadpool and Wolverine. I do have faith that Twisters is going to have pretty good legs. And so even if we see a sharp drop this upcoming weekend, I think the movie is going to do well through the rest of July and going into August. Let's look outside the US and Canada for the top 5 films internationally. And at number 1 is a film from China called Successor. It's actually a huge hit over in China. It did not show up on last week's show because it had Saturday shows that were technically counted as previews. It actually did a huge amount of box office last weekend, but it's just the way that the release was structured. But it's the number 1 movie internationally this weekend at $85.2 million. Successor is about a rich kid who's raised in simulated poverty in order to keep him grounded. In second place was Despicable Me 4 at $51.9 million, followed by Inside Out 2 at $34.2 million. As strong as Twisters is domestically, it is not showing that same strength internationally. It came in fourth at $27.1 million, and I think that sort of America-centric marketing that helped it to overperform domestically is cutting its grosses a little bit internationally, so we'll see where that all settles out. In fifth place internationally is another film from China called A Place Called Silence at $15.6 million. When you combine the international grosses with our domestic grosses, we get the top 5 films worldwide, and Twisters rides its domestic debut to number 1 worldwide at $107.6 million. That's an 835% increase from last weekend where it was only open in a few international markets. Successor is in second place with its $85.2 million. Despicable Me 4 is in third with another $75.7 million. That's a 42.9% drop worldwide from last weekend. Inside Out 2 is in fourth at $47 million. That's just a 33.8% drop from last weekend. And Longlegs also holds well internationally, largely because it's being driven by the domestic market. It dropped 33.3% for a $17.1 million weekend. And when we look at illumination by worldwide gross, Despicable Me 4 is at the cusp of $600 million now worldwide. It is number 8 all-time for illumination. It's just behind the worldwide gross of Sing. It has passed the worldwide gross of the first Despicable Me film. And in this next week, it should pass Sing, but then it's got a huge gap to make up if it wants to hit number 6, where The Secret Life of Pets is, at $886 million. I don't think it's going to get there, but it should be pretty comfortably there at number 7. Also looking at the highest grossing animated films of all time, Inside Out 2 has now bypassed the Super Mario Brothers movie. It is now number 2 all time, and it's about $10 million away from passing Frozen 2. So its strong performance, both domestically and internationally, by the time we do this show here next week, will make it officially the highest grossing Pixar film worldwide, the highest grossing Pixar film domestically, and the highest grossing animated film of all time worldwide. Again, please do not bring up The Lion King. If you want to know why I'm not counting it, go back a couple weeks. I talk about it on that episode. Before we jump into more charts from this past weekend, I want to make a couple revisions to last week's show. Many times when the actual numbers come in, there are a couple of things that didn't quite make the cut, given the fact that we use estimated numbers here. on Charts with Dan, and there were really only a couple of minor revisions from last week's show. First of all, when we look at the biggest theater count changes for the weekend of July 12th, Blue Lock the movie episode Nagi actually tied the Bike Riders for most theaters lost. It lost 838 theaters and was remaining in only 19, so it basically went out of release last weekend. That number was not available at the time I did the show. Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1 stayed in third. It lost 747 theaters before losing another 1,200 this past weekend. Then we had the Garfield movie and Kill at numbers 4 and 5. Looking at the per theater averages for the weekend of the 12th through the 14th, there's only one addition here, which is the movie Water Brother in third place. It's a documentary about legendary surfer and skater Sid Abruzzi. It had not reported grosses when we did the show last week, so it comes in at number 3 with $12,699 in just one theater. That bumped America's Burning down to 4th and National Anthem down to 5th. And then looking at the limited release films from last week, there was really only one change, which is that Robot Dreams expanded to 300 theaters and actually came in 5th at $79,000. The top 4 remain the same, with Touch, Kinds of Kindness, Sing Sing, and Kill at number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just the addition of Robot Dreams there to round out that top 5. All right, let's get a summer update here. These are the top 10 movies of the summer domestically, and really there's only one change down there at number 9. The top 8 remain the same. Inside Out 2 is at number 1. Despicable Me 4 is at number 2. Bad Boys Ride or Die is now squarely in the number 3 spot. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is at number 4. A Quiet Place Day 1 is at number 5. If is at number 6 at $111.1 million. It appears to have now ended its box office run. Same with The Fall Guy at $92.9 million. It has also seemingly ended its box office run. The Garfield movie is about $1.2 million behind The Fall Guy. That could be very consequential when it comes to my top 10 summer picks, but I don't know if it's got that much money left in the tank. So that could really be the difference between me getting 7 or 8 right or me getting 8 or 9 right, but it's there at number 8. Twisters enters the list at number 9 with its $80.5 million opening. That bumps Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, down to number 10, which means that it will be, once Deadpool and Wolverine hits this chart next week, the first casualty from my summer predictions list. The Strangers Chapter 1 is now out of the summer top 10, and looking at my summer predictions, I picked Despicable Me 4 number 1, and I picked Deadpool and Wolverine number 2. So I hope it does well, because I want to at least maybe get that one right. But look there at number 4. I picked Twisters number 4. A lot of people said I was crazy. I just had a feeling. I had a feeling that that movie was going to do well, and if you feel it, chase it. So I'm not feeling so bad about picking Twisters number 4 right now. Sometimes I have a gut feeling that goes wrong. This one seemed to have gone right. However, my gut feeling about Furiosa, Mad Max Saga was not correct. I picked it as the 6th highest grossing movie of the summer. It will be off this chart by the time we do the show next week, so that is going to turn red. But my other picks are still alive. Once Deadpool and Wolverine opens, the only movie that I picked that will not have opened yet is Alien Romulus on August 16th. I still feel okay about that, but who knows? You never really know which way any of these movies are going to go. We've got a lot more to break down, but before we do, I want to thank my partner for this week's show. This video is brought to you by AG1. My weeks are pretty crazy. Sometimes I'm sitting in front of my computer for hours hunting and researching information for videos. Other times I'm on the road to catch a screening. So it's important that I'm able to find some consistency in doing the best things for my health. That's why no matter what I'm doing, I'm glad that I can start off each day with AG1. AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that delivers daily nutrients and gut health support and is backed by multiple research studies, so you can trust what you're putting in your body. And I get it. Everybody wants to make sure that they're paying attention to what they put in their body. That's why AG1's in-house team of doctors and scientists works with third-party experts to validate the benefits of AG1, and it is backed by multiple studies and trusted by experts and medical professionals. My hours can get really weird, and I need to make sure that when I need the energy to work, that I have it. AG1 contains ingredients that support sustained energy, which helps me to be the best Dan that I can be every day. If I had to recommend one product to support whole body health, it's AG1, and that's why I'm excited to have them as a partner on the show. Starting your journey with AG1 is a win. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase at drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan. Check it out. Let's take a look at what I call the specialty charts for the past weekend. And first of all, we have the per theater average. And at number one was Twisters, which made $19,393 in each of its 4,151 theaters around the country. Sing Sing spends a second week on this chart, bringing in $16,021 per theater, still in just 4 theaters. In third place is Great Absence, a family drama / mystery from Japan. It played in just 1 theater and brought in $9,440. Playing in 2 theaters is the film Crossing, a film from Georgia, not the state, about a woman traveling to Istanbul to find her niece. It brought in $8,118 per theater in 2 theaters. And then bracketing the top 5 is another wide release, Despicable Me 4, which brought in $5,788 per theater in 4,112 theaters. Looking at the films in limited release, at number 1 was Bad News, with just over $1 million in 477 theaters. In second place was Oddity, which played in 703 theaters. It brought in $555,000. Oddity is a horror movie from Ireland about a medium who's attempting to solve her sister's murder, and I've actually heard some very good things about the movie. So if I don't see it in theaters, I will definitely try to check it out when I can watch it at home. In third place is Baltasar Kormakor's film Touch, which brought in $276,000 in 326 theaters. In fourth place was Widow Clicquot. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't really speak French. It was in 102 theaters and brought in $190,000. And the movie is a Champagne family origin story starring Haley Bennett, who is actually great in the ill-fated Jonathan Majors breakout movie Magazine Dreams that was never released because of all the issues around Jonathan Majors. Hopefully this will help to boost her career, because I think that movie really would have had it come out. And then in fifth place was Kinds of Kindness in 150 theaters. It brought in $114,700 in its 5th week of release. All right, looking at the 2024 domestic box office, there's no change from last week. I just like to put it here on the show for the record. Inside Out 2 is at number 1, Dune Part 2 is at 2, Despicable Me 4 is at number 3, Godzilla Kong the New Empire is at number 4, and Kung Fu Panda 4 is at number 5, depending on how Deadpool and Wolverine does, and there are estimates that are all over the place. It's possible that it could enter this top 5, but it's almost guaranteed that it's going to enter this top 10. Bad Boys Ride or Die is at 6, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is at 7, A Quiet Place Day 1 is at 8, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is at 9, and If is at number 10, and it looks likely that If will get dropped off of this list next week. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office, there are a few changes here. Inside Out 2 is at number 1 and Dune Part 2 is at number 2, but Despicable Me 4 jumps 4 spaces to number 3. Try saying that without getting all those numbers mixed up. Godzilla Kong the New Empire drops down 1 spot. Kung Fu Panda 4 drops down 1 spot. YOLO and Pegasus 2 from China also drop down 1 spot each. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes remains at number 8, although Bad Boys Ride or Die is closing in quick. It's at number 9. And Article 20 from China is at number 10. And we have some big changes on the worldwide box office 365-day chart. These are the 10 highest grossing movies that were released from July 22nd, 2023 to July 22nd, 2024. And 2 of the top 3, I believe, are now gone because Barbie and Oppenheimer, by virtue of coming out the same weekend, have now completed their 365-day tour and have rotated off the chart. Had Barbie stayed on the chart, I think it would have been still very narrowly ahead of the new champ, which is Inside Out 2, now the highest grossing film released in the last 365 days. Dune Part 2 moves up 2 spots to number 2. Wonka moves up 2 spots to number 3. But Despicable Me 4 is on the rise. It's at number 4 with $574.4 million. Godzilla Kong the New Empire moves up 1 spot into the top 5. Kung Fu Panda 4 is at number 6. No More Bets moves up 1 spot to number 7. YOLO moves up 1 spot to number 8. Pegasus 2 moves up 1 spot to number 9. And oh so briefly, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom from last December is back in the top 10 at $433.8 million. Before we wrap up the box office section of the show, as we so often do, I wanted to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back to July 18th through the 20th, 1986, which saw the opening of James Cameron's Aliens. Last week we talked about True Lies. This week we're going to talk about Aliens. It opens to $10 million back on July 18th, 1986. Its final domestic gross came in at $85.1 million. In second place was The Karate Kid Part 2 in its fifth week of release, dropping just 16.6%. It added another $5.5 million to its running total at that time of $61 million, but because movies hung around for so long back then, its final domestic total was at $115.1 million. Ruthless People came in third place. It was directed by the Zaz Boys, the directing team that brought you Airplane. In its fourth week of release, it also dropped 16.8% for $4.5 million. Its domestic total ended at $71.6 million. At number 4 was the Rodney Dangerfield comedy Back to School. If you don't know who Rodney Dangerfield was, I guess at this point, ask your parents. It was in its sixth week of release. It dropped 19.3% for a $4.2 million weekend. Its final domestic total was $91.2 million. That's right, more than Aliens. And in fifth place was Top Gun in its 10th week of release. It dropped 14.4% for a $4 million weekend, a $95.3 million domestic total, but it finished at $176.7 million. That's just how long it hung around. Of course, it's kind of tough to parse those numbers if you don't quite know how they'd stack up to today's numbers. So we're going to do, as we almost always do, something, which is to hit the inflation button. And when we hit that inflation button, we see that Aliens opened to an adjusted total of $28.8 million on its way to an adjusted final total of $244.1 million. Still good, but given its legacy, I think some people might be surprised that it was that quote-unquote low. The Karate Kid Part 2 is at $15.9 million adjusted, a final domestic total of $329.9 million adjusted for inflation. Ruthless People is at $12.9 million on its way to a $205 million adjusted domestic final. Back to School is at $12.1 million. It ended up at $261.5 million adjusted for inflation. And Top Gun came in at $11.6 million on its way to an adjusted domestic total of just over $500 million, $506.7 million. So that's what's been going on at the box office. Let's look at the streaming charts, which we have reincorporated back into the show. And we're going to look at the latest week that we have of Netflix data, which is the week of July 8th through the 14th, which saw Beverly Hills Cop Axel F remain at the top of the most viewed programs on Netflix with another 22.23 million views. Behind Beverly Hills Cop in second place was a Netflix original film called Vanished into the Night, an Italian film about a father looking for his missing children. Malignant's Annabelle Wallis also co-starred in that movie. A Family Affair starring Nicole Kidman and Zac Efron came in third place, another 11.5 million views, followed by Supercell Season 1, which has been a little bit of a breakout hit on Netflix. It's in the top 4 with another 7 million views. In fifth place was a Netflix film called Goyo, which is an Argentinian film about an autistic man whose routines are challenged when he falls in love with a coworker. It brought in 6.8 million views. In sixth place was Desperate Lies Season 1, a series from Brazil that is also, and I'm not making this up, believe it or not, about a woman who's pregnant with twins from two different fathers. Desperate Lives and the Indian film Bad News are like the Deep Impact and Armageddon of heteropaternal superfecundation. In seventh place was the documentary The Man with 1,000 Kids at 5.42 million views. Then we had the third and final season of the spinoff show Vikings Valhalla, which debuted to 5.38 million views. Paw Patrol the movie sticks around the top 10 with another 4.68 million views. And hitting the top 10 is Denzel Washington in The Equalizer, which brought in 4.23 million views. When we look at the top 10 most watched movies on Netflix in 2024, this is since January 1st, Beverly Hills Cop Axel F breaks onto the list at number 9. That bumps Irish Wish down to number 10. Trigger Warning gets bumped down to number 8 by A Family Affair. A Family Affair has brought in 70.26 million views so far versus 63.32 for Trigger Warning and 63.28 for Beverly Hills Cop Axel F. So Axel F should be up at least one more spot next week. The top 5 remains the same for 2024. Damsel is at 138 million views, followed by Lift, Society of the Snow, Under Paris, and Atlas. Looking at the top 10 most watched 2024 shows on Netflix, so this is global views since January 1st, we have a new champion as Bridgerton Season 3 has now become the most watched Netflix show of the year at 98.47 million global views. That knocks Fool Me Once down to number 2 at 98.16 million views, but the rest of the top 10 remains the same. Baby Reindeer just picked up several Emmy nominations. It's at number 3 at 86.87 million views. And the rest of the top 5 is rounded out by The Gentleman Season 1 and Griselda, which has 62.23 million views. And when we combine all that together to see what the top 10 most watched programs are on Netflix since January 1st, Damsel, Lift, and Society of the Snow make up the top 3, but look how close it is between Bridgerton Season 3, Society of the Snow, and Lift. Bridgerton's at 98.47 million views, Society of the Snow is at 98.52 million, and Lift is at 98.93 million. So Bridgerton Season 3 should be up in that number 2 spot when we talk about it on next week's show. Fool Me Once falls down to number 5. Under Paris, Baby Reindeer, Atlas, and Mother of the Bride are numbers 6, 7, 8, and 9. And A Family Affair breaks onto the 10 most watched Netflix programs of the year at 70.26 million, which drops The Gentleman Season 1 out of the top 10. So that's what's going on at Netflix. Let's look at what's happening at Nielsen. It looks like they've got the data coming out on a regular schedule, so we just have 1 week of Nielsen data instead of 0 weeks or 2 weeks like we've been having. This is delayed by about a month. So this is June 17th through the 23rd, and this is US viewing data only. And let's look first at the most watched streaming movies. At number 1 was the debut of Trigger Warning, which had 12.6 million hours watched, followed by Inside Out on Disney+. This coincides with the release of Inside Out 2 in theaters, so this also benefited streaming on Disney+, because the original film brought in 10.1 million hours watched. At number 3 is Oppenheimer, which wrapped up its exclusive run on Peacock and had its debut week on Amazon bring in 6.85 million hours watched. Then we have Hitman at number 4 on Netflix, followed by Ultraman Rising at number 5. Tell Them You Love Me, a documentary that aired on Netflix, is new on the chart at number 6 with 4.8 million hours watched. Then we have perennial favorite Moana at number 7. The Lego Batman movie, which is available on Max, but I would imagine the bulk of these numbers came from Netflix, is in 8th place at 4.1 million views, followed by Home at number 9, and 50 Shades of Grey, because why not, at 3.65 million hours watched. When we look at the most watched streaming movies in the US through June 23rd, according to Nielsen, the Super Mario Bros. Movie remains number 1, followed by Moana, Damsel, and Roadhouse, but Netflix's Hitman now moves up into the top 5 at 40.5 million hours watched. So Glenn Powell is a hit on streaming and he's a hit in theaters. Lift gets bumped down to number 6, followed by Wish, Atlas, and Madam Web, which all move down 1 spot. 2021's Dune remains the 10th most watched movie of the year, available on Max and Netflix at 32.9 million hours watched. Looking at the most watched streaming shows for June 17th to the 23rd, Bridgerton remains number 1. This was off of the debut of that second batch of episodes with 41 million hours watched. Your Honor remains the breakout licensed show of the summer, much like we saw with Suits last year, with 32.4 million hours watched. Then we have The Boys on Amazon at 21.5 million hours watched, and House of the Dragon makes its return to the charts as its second season began in earnest on Max at 20.4 million hours watched. And I'll say the same caveat that I always do with House of the Dragon or any show that's basically a simulcast between Max and HBO. It's always impressive to me that they're able to make these charts, and especially in the top 5, because unlike shows that are on streaming only, anybody that watches House of the Dragon on linear HBO on cable doesn't get included in this figure. So there are likely a good deal more people watching House of the Dragon than we're seeing on these figures, because there are some, I'm sure, people out there that are not watching it on Max, but are still tuning in, literally turning the channel on their TV and watching House of the Dragon that way. Bluey gets bumped all the way down to number 5 at 18.5 million hours watched, followed by Grey's Anatomy, Criminal Minds, and NCIS. Family Guy returns to the top 10 at 14.6 million hours watched, followed by Bob's Burgers at number 10. When we look at this week as far as watch time per available episode, so we take the total watch time divided by the number of episodes that are available to watch, the documentary series Perfect Wife, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sherry Papini, was actually number 1. This is a Hulu docuseries about a California woman's disappearance. It brought in 2.02 million hours watched per episode with 3 available episodes. Then we have Bridgerton at 1.71 million hours watched per episode, and House of the Dragon at 1.7 million hours watched per episode. Keep in mind, this is all seasons of both shows. It's not just the new season that people were watching. Then we have Your Honor at 1.62 million hours watched per episode. America's Sweethearts, which is a docuseries following the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, comes in 5th at 842,000 hours watched per episode. At number 6 is The Boys at 768,000 hours watched per episode, followed by Perfect Match, Sweet Tooth, King of Collectibles, and Mayor of Kingstown, with 245,000 hours watched per episode. It should be noted that not included on any of these charts is The Acolyte. It was not one of the 10 most watched original series of the week, and so we're not going to get any viewing data for that week, at least not from Nielsen. I think it is somewhat telling that The Acolyte couldn't even make it to the top 10, because that indicates that the viewership maybe wasn't as strong as people had hoped. We'll see if it pops up here on the chart in later weeks. A couple changes in the yearly charts. First of all, when we look at the most watched library streaming series of the year, so these are series that are not originals but were licensed to different streaming services. The top 4 are the same: Bluey, Grey's Anatomy, Young Sheldon, and NCIS, but Family Guy breaks into the top 5 at 173.8 million hours watched for the year. And really, it's Nielsen's change in how they measure shows on Hulu and elsewhere that have helped to move Family Guy into that top 5, because it rarely, if ever, showed up on the Nielsen top 10 before this. So Nielsen is still improving their metrics and ways that they can measure things. Criminal Minds moves up to number 6 for the year. Suits moves down to number 7. The Big Bang Theory stays put at number 8. Bob's Burgers moves up to 9, another beneficiary of this revised metric that Nielsen's able to use. And The Resident on Hulu moves down to number 10. This latest season of Bridgerton has also made it the 3rd most watched streaming series overall since Nielsen began reporting numbers back in 2020. Ozark remains number 1 at 780 million total hours, followed by Stranger Things at 779.9 million, but Bridgerton has now breached 600 million hours watched when you include all hours across all seasons. That moves The Crown down to number 4, Virgin River down to number 5, Love is Blind down to number 6, Manifest down to number 7, Cobra Kai down to number 8, although we have new episodes of Cobra Kai. They're going to start counting towards that total when viewership data comes in a few weeks. Wednesday's now at number 9. Remember, that's just one season of Wednesday versus multiple seasons of, I think, all the rest of these shows. And then The Great British Baking Show remains down there at number 10. So that wraps it up for the streaming ratings. Let's take a look now before we go at what is hitting theaters and streaming this week, or at least some of the things that you'll be able to see. Starting on Tuesday and also on Thursday night, there will be limited screenings of a new movie called The Good Half from director Robert Schwartzman. It stars Nick Jonas and Brittany Snow, and it will be paired with a video Q&A after the movie. This Thursday on Netflix, a new series called The Decameron, which is a loose adaptation of the Italian collection of short stories, will premiere. The cast includes Zoisha Mamet and Tony Hale. Then, of course, this Friday in theaters everywhere is Deadpool and Wolverine. I'm actually on the road today to go see the movie. I will hopefully, unless something goes wrong, have my review ready for you tomorrow evening at the embargo time. In select theaters this Friday was one of my favorite movies from the Sundance Film Festival, Dee Dee. If it's not playing in a theater near you, then you should try to see it if it expands to a theater near you, because I really like this movie. In many theaters nationwide is another film this Friday called The Fabulous Four. It stars Susan Sarandon, Bette Midler, Megan Mullally, and Cheryl Lee Ralph as 4 friends who reunite when one of them gets married. This is like the 3rd or 4th version of this movie we've seen this year. Also on Friday, if you want to see the Olympics opening ceremony in IMAX, it will be playing in select IMAX theaters around the country. It's in the middle of the day, so it looks like they're going to surrender maybe one showing of Deadpool and Wolverine in order to do this, although I certainly wouldn't do that. Also, in general, the Olympics start this Friday, and you can watch them here in the United States across the NBC family of networks. And then if you're not interested in any of that, this Friday on Netflix is Elite Season 8, the 8th season of the Spanish prep school drama that often puts up some pretty impressive viewership numbers. And just to set a baseline standard as far as Deadpool and Wolverine, here are a couple of numbers to know. First of all, these are the highest grossing R-rated openings of all time domestically. Right now, the first Deadpool movie has the record at $132.4 million, followed by Deadpool 2 at $125.5 million, It at $123.4 million, Joker at $96.2 million, and The Matrix Reloaded at $91.7 million. If Deadpool and Wolverine does what it is expected to do, it should have that number 1 opening of all time for an R-rated movie, but keep that number in mind, $132.4 million. That is the number to keep in mind for a new record. It's also the number to keep in mind if we're looking at a new record in the expanded X-Men universe, because right now Deadpool has the best opening weekend in X-Men history at $132.4 million, followed by Deadpool 2, X-Men The Last Stand, X-Men Days of Future Past, and Logan back in 2017. And I am prepping a lot of Deadpool and X-Men and R-rated charts for next week's show. And I'll be here, of course, 1 week from today to talk about the opening of Deadpool and Wolverine and how well Twisters holds up. I'll also be back, as I said, tomorrow with my non-spoiler review of the film. I'll probably do my spoiler review on Friday, and I'm working on a couple of other video ideas, so stay tuned right here on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check the description below for more information about my partners for this episode, as well as more information about the channel. I'll be right back here, as always, with more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.